Throughout his archaeological career, Dr. Henry Jones Jr. has faced many different supernatural threats. And in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle's brilliant story, that tradition is very much upheld, both to the benefit and detriment of the game. While most of the inexplicable occurrences in the original Indiana Jones films are believably rooted in his world full of adventure and intrigue, the more recent Indy stories have arguably taken things to an almost nonsensical extreme, with the introduction of aliens and time travel. In The Great Circle, then, the narrative's more mystical twists were always going to risk stretching credulity. And yet, though it might be a pretty low bar to clear, I'm pretty sure that The Great Circle is the best Indiana Jones story since The Last Crusade released in 1989, in addition to being an extremely fun and immersive video game. That said, there are still some very obvious issues with its unusual relic-powered revelations, and there are two sequences in the game in particular that push things just a little bit too far into the realm of the unbelievable. So does The Great Circle successfully resolve its central mystery in the end, or is its thrilling narrative somewhat hampered by excessively supernatural events? Obviously, there will be spoilers ahead.
Alright, pal. You can't sleep here.
The story of The Great Circle begins when a terrifying giant named Locust steals Indy's favorite cat mummy from the Marshall College Museum. After linking the thief to the Vatican's secret archive and befriending the genuinely delightful Italian journalist Gina Lombardi, Indiana Jones soon locates his stolen mummy in a hidden underground vault, along with a variety of other snazzy statuettes, only to have some smug Nazi archaeologist called Emmerich Voss waltz in just after them and smash every single figurine to bits. Because, as it turns out, they all contain a carved chunk of rock imbued with immense power related to a great circle of aligned holy sites. And if you collect them all, you can power up Noah's flippin' Ark and kickstart another great flood. But before I get to discussing that arc, it's important to first discuss a different seafaring vessel. After collecting the artifacts from the Vatican, Voss heads to Giza to find another Great Circle relic underneath Khafre's pyramid, which Indy helpfully retrieves for him. Then, Voss sends his insecure male underling, Gantz, to the Himalayas to collect yet another carved rock, as Indy and Gina make their own way to South Asia to beat him to the punch. And there the pair find the KMS Kumets, a lost Nazi battleship inexplicably sitting atop a mountain. As you explore the frozen ship, you'll soon learn exactly how it managed to end up so far away from any ocean, by recovering the relic responsible for the event and making it happen again once Indy and Gina find themselves in a bit of a sticky situation. All it takes, apparently, is reading the inscription on the relic in its original Adamic language, and the pair are almost instantaneously transported from the Himalayas to Shanghai through some mystical power that ostensibly folds the earth. This pivotal moment in the story certainly left me with some mixed feelings, because even though this teleportation sequence felt a little bit too extraordinary to me, I also think that waking up in the Battle of Shanghai as Japanese planes fly overhead and buildings crumble all around you made for one of the most brilliant blockbuster sequences in this game or any other. And I also can't deny that they did a pretty decent job of setting this twist up, even if it was potentially a step too far. For most of the early part of the game, the clues and hints you uncover are intentionally ambiguous when alluding to the specific powers of the Great Circle's relics. So too is Voss as he talks about these rocks. And all in all, that's definitely not a bad thing. The vague threat of some mysterious mystical power is at the heart of all of Indy's best stories, whether it comes from the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail. And the mystery of these carved rocks scattered across the globe certainly fits that mold quite well. There are some very gentle suggestions about their capacity for folding the earth though, which is just enough to put the idea in the player's head. And then when you explore Voss's office in Egypt, a letter from failed artist Adolf Hitler makes note of their battleship disappearing off the coast of Peru, putting that odd occurrence in the player's mind as well. That way, when you learn about and eventually see the frozen ship in the Himalayas, the dots start to connect and it becomes very clear that something almost unbelievable must have happened. And so, when Indy folds the earth himself, you have all the evidence you need of the power inherent in the relics, paying off on all of the earlier setup. When it happens, this incredible anomaly definitely doesn't feel outright ridiculous. But as an Indiana Jones supernatural event, it does feel closer in scale and tone to the Dial of Destiny's time travel, rather than spirits emerging from the Ark of the Covenant. I don't think it's quite as unbelievable as the Antikythera time travel, or anywhere near as absurd as the Kingdom of the Crystal Skulls alien stuff, but it also doesn't feel as firmly rooted in the world of Indiana Jones as any of the events in the original trilogy of films do. But regardless, I still believe that on the whole, this twist does work in the Great Circle's story. It exhibits a truly magnificent power related to the artifacts, and it does so in a spectacular way. That said, the game's other big mystical twist and its eventual finale doesn't work quite as well in my opinion, especially when considering how it links back to this teleportation moment.
Only thing I know is, no one can ever use those stones again. Nazis use them, they end up on the top of a mountain, we use them, and we end up dodging bullets and bombs in a war zone. We've seen what happens when mortals mess with this kind of power. It doesn't end well.
After escaping from Shanghai and recovering one more artifact from Sukhothai, Gina manages to get herself captured and Indy has to head to the Ziggurat of with his new best friend Locus to rescue her. Then, against Locus's advice, when the intrigue is just too much to bear, Indy and Gina descend beneath the ancient structure, where they discover that the Nazis have found and claimed Noah's Ark. Much like finding the battleship on a mountain, this reveal is pretty dramatic and exciting, and it brings up a lot of very interesting narrative possibilities. But unlike with that Nazi vessel, I don't think the unveiling of the Ark is set up nearly as well. Prior to discovering Noah's Ark, the game makes little to no mention of this humongous lost ship, and so seeing it for the first time was certainly a big surprise to me. And while that didn't dramatically lessen the impact of the moment, it does feel like a mistake to introduce such a huge new element to the story in this final sequence of the game without linking it directly back to earlier events or foreshadowing the reveal more effectively. When you arrive at the Ziggurat of knowing that all of the artifacts are finally almost together again, you might assume that they will all need to be assembled with some kind of interface or tomb or device within the structure. So learning that they actually all fit into slots on Noah's flippin' Ark is unquestionably unusual, and it immediately shatters all your expectations for the finale. After teleporting from the Himalayas to Shanghai, it seemed pretty clear to me that whatever the combined artifacts were capable of, it was going to have something to do with manipulating space to allow instantaneous travel. And sure enough, Voss is expecting pretty much the same thing too. And it makes a lot of sense why the Nazis would want to control that kind of power. When he captures Indy near the Ark, Voss tells him all about his evil plan to control the Great Circle's teleportation powers and turn himself into a sort of magic wizard Nazi. And again, that basically all makes sense. The teleportation stuff might be a bit too extraordinary, but it all works together regardless. But then, in the same conversation, Voss also properly introduces to the story for the first time the myth of the Great Flood. That being the various stories from various cultures which tell of unstoppable waves swallowing up their world, with one of those stories being, of course, that of Noah's Ark. And this information from Voss is critical because ultimately, after he has slotted them into their slots and said the magic words, what these combined relics actually end up doing is starting another Great Flood. Well, technically, the first thing they do is zap Voss with some lightning. But then, not long after, the wind picks up and the rain starts falling, and soon enough, Voss has a chance to show off his karate in a fight with Indy. Before eventually, Locus uses the Wheel of Relics to suck the life out of him with an Ark of the Covenant style laser beam. And then, as Indy and Gina make their escape, Locus takes the wheel and pilots the ship through a great big spinning portal thing, which is reminiscent of the one that went from the Himalayas to Shanghai. So, presumably, Locus goes on to happily sail Noah's teleporting ark around the globe as Indy and Gina get back to their normal lives. In many ways, I think this ending does a good job of wrapping up the story and delivering an action-packed finale. Indy being tied up as Voss invites the wrath of God upon himself is certainly reminiscent of Raiders of the Lost Ark's conclusion, though it does definitely feel like there should have been a bigger Nazi audience there for these final moments, to act as cannon fodder for the storm. Either way, though, it's the means by which the Ark and the Flood are introduced so late in the game that lessens the impact of the sequence for me. For what it's worth, I think that the Great Flood within an Indiana Jones story is the perfect level of myth-inspired mystical threat. But in addition to not being set up well, I also think it just feels a bit strange in combination with the teleportation thing. I think I probably would have preferred it if these stones were, from the start, closely associated with water and floods, and that was always the mystical power of the Great Circle. With the many different myths about floods from around the world coming together and Noah's Ark at the center of the legend, it would be as if the stones represented a reset button for the Earth, a means of wiping clean everything not on the Ark. I think that having that option would be pretty desirable for the Nazis, and it would also be a pretty serious threat for Indy to face. But as it stands in the finale, the Great Flood and Noah's Ark just feels a bit disconnected from the rest of the story, and especially from the well-executed teleporting battleship sequence. If they had committed instead to just the teleportation thing and no Ark or Great Flood, then I also think that that would have worked and felt a lot more cohesive. Either way, a more consistent mystical power would have been more meaningful to me. But in the end, I did still enjoy this ending, and I'm glad at least that it didn't dramatically ramp up the extraordinary elements too much. I just can't help but wish that the whole sequence had been more effectively foreshadowed or more directly connected to the events of the rest of the game.
You have the classic from the Hebrew Bible, the Sumerian creation myth, the Great Flood of the Chinese Ganyu, the Blood Deluge of Ymir, and of course there's the numerous Greek myths. While the names of the survivors change, Noah, Pyrrha, and Deucalion,
they all point to the same real event.
As much as I love the Great Circle, I do think that the big thematic problem with its central mystery is that the various statuettes and their relics across the globe are all associated with vastly different ancient religions and societies. The story ties them all together with its race of giants and connected myths, but it is hard to ignore an obvious mismatch between the variety of holy sites and the problems that creates for the story's eventual revelations. The game tries to link these disparate civilizations together with a single origin point, in order to tell an Indiana Jones story that takes the player to as many diverse locations as possible. But in doing so, it also regularly muddies the individual myths and legends associated with the places you visit. Ultimately though, this is not a big problem when playing, because the mystery is so often discussed in terms of vague riddles, and because the gameplay loop is so much fun. It only really becomes obvious then when the relics from 17 different holy sites around the world are assembled on Noah's Ark, a vessel so closely associated with the Book of Genesis that it's hard to reconcile with the other involved religions, even if there are connections through legendary floods and similar stories. Whatever the case, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is still a fantastically fun game with a genuinely great story overall, and it looks especially good next to the more recent indie films. But I do think that its story could have worked just as well, if not better, with less extraordinary twists and a more consistent mystical threat. But how do you feel about the Great Circle's supernatural twists and its ending? Let me know in the comments, and please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk more stories and more games. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.